I grabbed some underwear out of my luggage and stuffed them into my backpack between my journal and my toothbrush. I walked up a few steps to coach seating. The Empire Builder was scheduled to leave at 4 o'clock from Seattle. In preparation for the ride, I brought a box of Annie's granola bars, which joined a handful of mini bottles of Tennessee bourbon in the bottom of my bag. I'd been visiting Meredith, who's here, who gave me a bag of fresh Washington cherries when she dropped me off at the train station. That morning, we'd seen an exhibit of Mick Rock's photography in Seattle's Museum of Pop Culture, featuring enlarged black and white prints of David Bowie, Iggy Pop, and Lou Reed in their youth. One image showed David Bowie reclining, eyes closed, in a train sleeper car. The caption noted that he was terrified of flying and preferred to cross the U.S. by rail. I remember reading somewhere that during his Young Americans era, Bowie subsisted only on cocaine, peppers, and milk. I found an empty pair of seats and looked out, my forehead pressed against the cool window as the summer sun hung low over a deep blue sky. I had recently completed a writing residency in rural Washington. I opted for something different on the way home instead of another cross-country flight. I imagined the tidy confinement of a sleeper car, a cozy compartment of my own from which to wistfully stare out the window. When booking tickets, I learned that a sleeper car of one's own for the 2,206-mile ride from Seattle to Chicago cost nearly $1 per mile, affordable only to the David Bowies among us. I settled for a seat in coach at a cool 180. Certainly less cinematic, but I'd still have a window and the same endless expanse of track to peer out from. The landscape began slowly rolling by as the train pulled away from the station. In 45 hours, I would arrive in Chicago on July 4th. I was 31, responsible only to my after-school teaching job in Boston. I subbed at the school for extra money, and in the summers emptied my savings account to travel or come to residencies like the one I just finished. My most valuable asset was a bike. A fourth grader I worked with, who pressed the back of her hand to my forehead when she worried I was sick, asked me about school shootings and told me she was afraid to go to high school. I attended protests on Sundays and made micro-donations to the ACLU and ignored the nagging sense of the futility of it all. My long relationship with someone I loved constantly teetered on its edge before righting itself, only to teeter again. The New England winters never really seemed to end, only to break for a quick recess. I was getting older and the sea levels were rising. Two catastrophic processes that showed no signs of abating. Time seemed to be running out for a habitable world and in my own life for becoming what I was meant to be. I was waiting for something to happen, a flash of inspiration or courage that would change my life. In lieu of all that, just to shake myself loose from the usual, I put myself on a train across America. The Empire Builder embarked on its inaugural journey in 1929, running from Portland or Seattle to Chicago. Every year, it delivers thousands of passengers back home or carries them away to some other far-off destination. In the summer months, the train employs Park Service rangers to narrate the sights from the observation car. They act a little bit like baseball announcers. They offer a play-by-play of the natural and cultural history of the landscape. Passengers watching them through panoramic windows that curve up to the roof ask questions about birds. Bill and John were both around 60, dressed in starched khaki uniforms and simultaneously exuding a staid professionalism and a giddiness that this was their job. Bill was mustachioed and solidly built. John was trim with a British accent. As the train curled along the Puget Sound away from Seattle, Bill noted that we might catch a sighting of a cormorant, seal, or orca out the train window. Hopeful, I scanned the water for movement. I didn't see any charismatic marine mammals, but knowing they might be lurking beneath the surface of the water was thrilling enough. Further east in Sultan was the site of the Woodstock before Woodstock, the 1968 Sky River Rock Festival, which featured the Grateful Dead and Santana. We continued to Wallace Falls, higher than Niagara Falls, like Bill, and onto Index, Washington, the site of a gold boom in the 1880s. We raced into the new Cascade Tunnel, the longest tunnel in the lower 48, chirped John. The Rangers made a brief reference to the Chinese workers who had built the rail and blew out the mountain to make way for the tunnel we were riding through. Later, reading up on the train line, I learned that the Chinese laborers were treated as expendable, subhuman, as they worked to build a rail that would render the continent traversable for the first time. I'd become familiar with the process of reorienting myself to far darker truths than the ones I'd been taught as a child. 3 weeks earlier, I'd stared out the window over my residency desk, taking in the cold late spring of the Washington Mountains. The residency was housed in an empty elementary school that had been abandoned decades ago after the local mines went bust and the town's population plummeted. I had a chilly, 800 square foot classroom to myself to sleep and write in, not far off from the writer's garret I dreamed of as a kid. Next to the main building, an abandoned courtyard with a faded mural of Pacific Northwest flora and fauna led to an empty, echoing gym. Between writing sessions, I ran laps in the gym, which smelled of fresh varnish, as if it had been recently resurfaced for a basketball team that would never return. I marveled at and delighted in the desolation, hoping that this place, completely detached from any reality I'd ever known, would draw something indelible for me. Each day as the morning fog burned off, hummingbirds fluttered in the huge pink blossoms outside my window, treading the air with a sheer will I couldn't begin to relate to. Logging trucks rolled by my window at regular intervals. On my second day in town, while mailing some postcards, I was bitten by a gray Airedale Terrier named Shadow. He charged me while his owner called, "Shadow, Shadow," and then he sunk his teeth through my jeans and into my calf.
Oh.
My shock was mitigated by the rueful acknowledgement that I couldn't last long in Trump country without being attacked. The bite was shallow, and I recovered quickly. Mostly, I was glad to feel fully removed from my usual routines, the well-tread paths between work, the grocery store, the coffee shop, and the bar, the alarms set, and the snooze buttons hit. The air itself felt wider here. Alpine goldenrod burst from the damp green expanse of earth, dotting the endless wild landscape like dappled sunlight. In the evenings, the sky over the Cascades seemed to ignite, streaked with wisps of neon orange and pink. On a few nights during our stay, our daily word count goals nearly reached, the other writers and I ambled down the hill to the headquarters bar for a beer, where our faces were unfamiliar among the other patrons in this town of 200. Shadow barked frantically from a truck in the parking lot. We joined in on karaoke and fended off advances from the local guys at the bar who didn't know men can't approach strange women in public anymore. I envisioned my train ride home as an extension of the residency. Riding the Empire Builder, I hoped to access some truth that remained unknowable in a mode of stasis. In my seat, I thought again of David Bowie's young, free image suspended in the amber of black and white photos, unencumbered by the particular darkness of this moment. I wondered if listening to only David Bowie for the remainder of the summer would successfully transport me even partway out of the current era and solve at least some of my problems. I could attempt to crawl out from under the crushing weight of this extended period by living vicariously through his freedom and freakiness. Maybe he would shift my mood and reveal some truth, teach me something eternal that I was too blocked or too scared or too earthbound to realize on my own. That night, as darkness fell outside the train, I settled further into my seat, poured a whiskey nip into a can of seltzer, and queued up a David Bowie album on my iPod. We were heading east, away from the setting sun and into the lavender night. The first few chords of Rebel Rebel rang in my ears like a language I had learned a long time ago, somewhere far from here. Hot tramp, I love you so. I looked out the window as the dark trees rushed past underneath the stars. The next morning, I awoke to the sounds of John and Bill's broadcast from the observation car. I laid across the 2 plush seats with a travel blanket and pillow, which served as a sufficient bed. I lifted my eye mask and checked my phone. It was 7. White summer sunlight poured in through the wide windows. I sat up and stretched myself awake. We were in western Montana. I walked through a few cars to the back of the train and bought a watery coffee from the snack bar. A short staircase led me to the observation car, on the train's second floor. Here I could absorb John and Bill's geography lesson in person. The observation car was laid out like a diner, with fiberglass tables and vinyl booth seats. I slid into a booth and looked around. Most of my fellow travelers up here were a bit older than me, enjoying the trip with friends or their partners. They looked clean and less rumpled than I felt after 6 hours of sleep across 2 seats. John and Bill were relaying an amusing anecdote about a cargo truck losing all its corn and bears happily discovering the spoils months later. The corn had fermented in the interim, conjuring a satisfying image of intoxicated black bears. Drunk bears, I scribbled into my notebook. The train skated along the southern edge of Glacier National Park. Mountains loomed outside the north-facing windows. "Make sure you get a look at those glaciers," said Bill. "They won't be here in 10 or 15 years. I looked for them, squinting and finding nothing. I wondered if they were already gone. "Bear grass, lily family, continental divide, wild horses," I wrote, trying to keep up with the ranger's narration. I kept my eye on the horizon, searching for those horses. Outside the large windows, the sky was endless and blue. For 10 years, I've been steeling myself against the moment when life becomes more about remembering to buy dish soap than noticing the steady rate at which the clouds move across the sky on a bright summer day. Lately, the days seemed to rush by faster than I could account for them. I would get older, and the ice caps in Glacier National Park would disappear. The Earth and I were both expiring by the moment. I thought about how the train was built in the 20s when the country's era of cultural expansion and establishment as a global empire was still ahead of it, a distant glowing dream. Now the country and its future seemed to be crumpling as quickly as a leaf in a fire. The empire was being hollowed out and sold for parts. A man at a nearby table in a cowboy hat from Grand Rapids, Michigan, talked to another passenger about his career selling corporate office furniture. Who does life in America actually work for, I wondered. My attention drifted skyward again. I had so many dreams, cooed Bowie. I had so many breakthroughs. East of Glacier lies Blackfeet Nation. A group of middle-aged women joined my table as I looked out at the reservation. I worried they might ask me if I knew Jesus, so I busied myself with my journal. Larger than Delaware, the reservation is a vast expanse of land with a population density of 3 people per square mile. Further on, piles of discarded mattresses, tires, and washing machines formed small mountains, like an art installation implying the general mistake of humanity's existence on the planet. The next day was the 4th of July. I looked at this expanse, an unmistakable totem of a people successfully colonized, brutalized, and all but exterminated by the U.S. government. A woman at my table remarked, "It doesn't look very nice." The reservation disappeared behind us, and we forged ever onward through the empire. Bill and John departed the train once we reached the middle of Montana. I soon realized why. There's nothing but the mostly flat expanse of the upper Midwest for the remainder of the ride. I left the observation car and walked back downstairs to my seat in the coach. "How far are you going?" asked the girl on the other side of the table. I told her I was flying home to Boston after the line ended in Chicago. "Take me with you," she pleaded. Her name was Cassie, and she'd been visiting her brother in Seattle as a trial run to see if she should move there. She worried it was too expensive and was headed back home to Minot, North Dakota. She'd taken courses at a for-profit college and was on the hook for thousands in debt. She really wanted to be a baker, she told me. "I just want my life to mean something," she said. My neighbors were all younger than me and traveling by rail for the utility of cheap travel, not a misguided bid for some epiphany on a journey. 2 sisters from Washington, wrapped up tightly in blankets and neck pillows, were taking the train all the way to New York to see Times Square and camp out on Broadway for cheap tickets. The younger sister made sandwiches from bread and peanut butter they packed as the older sister touched up anime drawings on her iPad. A hiker on the Pacific Coast Trail abandoned the route because he had run out of money and spent the last of it on a ticket home to Minnesota. He planned to do some more construction work until he made enough to return to the trail. "I can't wait to get back," he said, with a far-off look in his eyes. Cody, in his early 20s, was working a low-level tech job in Seattle and couldn't afford the company housing and was headed home to his parents in southern Illinois. "It sounds dumb," he said, "but I've been reading The Secret, and I really believe that you manifest your reality. I know this is not a setback." "Why didn't you fly the whole way if you could afford it?" one of the sisters asked me. I don't know, I shrugged. I just thought it would be fun. She turned back to her iPad. A few hours later, and as an orange sun snuck below the top of the windows, we stopped in to note. Good luck, I called to Cassie as she pulled her suitcase off the rack. She turned around and waved. Later, the pink sky was softly reflected in the wet fields of North Dakota. It was a landscape of quiet beauty, still light at 9:30, the land itself blushing. What gorgeous country, I wrote in my notebook, that I would be afraid to set foot in. The conservative politics, the oil boom that began a violent crime boom, and makeshift towns populated exclusively by lonely men. An empty stretch of land punctured by oil rigs, the extracted resource the only point of value for American Earth. The election year before seemed to be the final blow to a country with a million little fractures. We seemed less willing to admit that those cracks had always been there. As a kid, I spent my summers on a New Hampshire beach. Every 4th, we'd watch the Americans defeat the British in Revolutionary War reenactments, an enduring, simple fairy tale that we loved to watch because we were good guys. The beauty of the summer sky, mirrored in the fields, both ordinary and breathtaking, called to mind Alice Walker's remark, "I love this land. I'm not crazy about the nation." I woke again early the next morning. It was July 4th. The sky was the light gray of a windless and humid summer day. We were in Minnesota now, winding through small towns, rushing across the Mississippi. Outside my window, an Independence Day 5K racers bounced along in American flag capes. Through Wisconsin, the landscape remained wide with the electric summer green of grass and trees until the terrain slowly became denser with houses as Chicago grew closer. That night in the airport, I charged a $12 beer in my credit card while waiting to board my final leg home. I wouldn't get the bill for a while. I flipped through the notes I'd taken on the train ride. I hadn't come up with much more than a few scribbled lines about the plants and animals along the route. Nothing had been revealed to me about America other than that it was too vast in its violence and beauty to imagine, even while staring at it. I watched through the airport window as fireworks soared over the city, in the middle of a country that now seemed bigger and more unknown to me than ever. We live for just these 20 years, do we have to die for 50 more? Crooned David Bowie as the sky above the city lit up with its fire show. Thank you.